If you haven't turned in your problem set, stick it up here. Today, things are, I think, going to start getting maybe a little bit more interesting. We're going to be talking about policy pretty much for the rest of the class. And the first policy issue we'll talk about is externalities. So I'm going to start by talking about the idea of an externality. In particular, the idea that a missing market price, that's what an externality is, makes people ignore some costs that are associated with actions that they take. And we'll talk about a classic example of that, and then about the solutions to it, in particular to target as closely as possible the particular price that's missing and to put a tax or a subsidy on that area. Okay. Then we'll turn to some things that you might think are a bit surprising that are externalities, and some other things that you might expect to be externalities that actually aren't externalities. In particular, we'll talk about pecuniary externalities and an issue of internalities, which are basically externalities within a person. Then we'll talk about public policy solutions to externalities, including Peruvian taxation, cap and trade, and things that go through litigation in the legal system. And then we'll talk about trade-offs between these different approaches. Finally, we'll turn to what's called Stigler's Coase theorem, which are private solutions to externality problems, and why these might or might not work. And we'll wrap up by discussing problems with these private solutions, and in particular, the lack of information that's needed to make bargaining work. And once we do that, that'll sort of motivate the lecture on Thursday, which will be about how we acquire the right information to solve externalities problems. Okay. So is Edward Liev here? No? So the reason why we found that the market was so efficient in our last lecture was that every time someone took an action, they had to pay for the consequences of that action or received a payment if the consequences of that action were beneficial. So in the market, if I want to have more fancy dinners, I have to pay for that. Because for every fancy dinner that I have, that's food that someone else couldn't be eating. I pay for the social opportunity cost of those resources. I pay that Lagrange multiplier on the value of those resources. On the other hand, if I get a job and I produce things that are valuable to other people, then I get paid for the value of what I produce for others, right? This principle is called payments in accordance with product. And anytime this fails to happen, anytime it's not the case that any cost I impose on other people I pay for, or any benefit I bring to other people I get paid for, we say that there's an externality that exists. And it's called an externality not because it affects someone other than me, which is the usual interpretation that I think people have, but rather because it's external to the system of prices. That's the key point. And similarly, if within myself there was some thing that I should be putting a Lagrange multiplier on that I'm not, people often call that an internality, but basically it's an externality as well. It's something that you're not taking properly into account when you make a decision. So externalities are not really about effects across people. They're about effects that are not taken into account in the system of prices. So Matt Solomon, what are some of the examples that people typically give of externalities?
The big one is like pollution. So the factory is making things, and the costs of like polluting a river or polluting the earth, that the social cost is not included in the price.
That's exactly right. Pollution is the classic example. Another example might be playing loud music at night, a beautiful building that people appreciate, but the owner doesn't get paid for it. That might have a positive externality because of all the people who walk by the building and enjoy it. Generating new ideas often has a big externality, because usually the person who generates the idea gets only a small part of the benefits associated with the idea. It spills over to all sorts of other people. And crime is a classic negative externality. If I steal something from you, I don't have to pay you for the cost of what I stole. So one simple example is smoking. And let's just take a mathematical example of that. Imagine that there were 100,000 people in downtown Chicago every day. And 10% of these people were smokers. And to each smoker, the value of smoking was $3 for every cigarette they chose smoke, minus S squared over 10, because they don't want to smoke too much. So we want them to have some convex cost of smoking additional amounts, right? Okay. And imagine that cigarettes cost $1 to produce. So their price before taxes is $1. K? Where's K again? K is right there. How much would people smoke? Each person.
Wait, so we wanted to.
So this, not how much would it be optimal for them to smoke, but how much are they going to smoke? If this is the value they get from smoking, and this is the price of buying cigarettes, how much would they choose to smoke?
So, okay, don't we want them to like equal each other then, or not?
Well, so this is the total value they get from smoking, right?
Right.
And this is the total cost of buying cigarettes, right? And so how do we determine what the optimal amount for each person to smoke would be from their perspective? Yeah.
So like 3 minus S over 5 is equal to 1.
Yeah.
So then, so wait, 3 minus S over 5 is equal to 1. So then 2 is equal to S over 10, or S over 5. So then 10.
Yep. So people smoke 10. Right? Good. Now, that's how much people are going to choose to smoke. But imagine that the other 90% of people who are non-smokers each get a disutility of 1/100,000th of a dollar from every cigarette that's smoked, right? Now, what would be the socially optimal amount of smoking, Wesley? Imagine that the other 90,000 people each get, for every cigarette that's smoking, a disutility of -1/100,000.
So then the total social disutility would be $90,000.
Well, it's 90,000 divided by 100,000, right?
Yeah.
So that's, because there's 90,000 people times -$100,000, 1/100,000 per person. So what's the total disutility for each cigarette smoked?
Well, isn't the total disutility in dollars 90,000? So then per cigarette would be 90 cents.
No, it's 90,000 divided by 100,000, because each person gets a utility of 1/100,000th of a dollar, right? And that and then there's 90,000 people who experience that. So what's the total disutility per cigarette smoked?
90 cents.
Exactly. Yeah, so there's 90 cents. And so what would be the socially optimal amount of cigarettes for people to smoke? Well, you want to add this disutility to the price that people should be paying, right? They should have to pay for the disutility that they cause, right?
So do you set 3 minus S over 5 equal to 1 plus 0.9?
Exactly.
So then 3 minus 1.9 times 5 is
5.5.
5.5.
Yeah, exactly. So that the optimal would be for people to smoke 5.5 cigarettes, not rather than 10. So that's much less than 10, right? So the problem here is that smokers are smoking too much because they don't internalize the cost of that their smoking creates for other people, right? And today we're going to talk about various ways of making them internalize this. So just to give you a little graph of what we just did, you would have sort of like a private demand for smoking, which was linear in the case we were talking about. And then there was a price, and that was determining a quantity of smoking. But there was also a social cost above that, which might have been of that size, say. And so the socially optimal amount was actually there. And the key is, how do we get things from here to here, right? And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Okay. So more generally, the principle behind this is that you should take into account the total externality you have on all other people. And that means adding up the harm that you do by taking the action, or the benefit that you give, over all the people it accrues to. And Pagu's principle of payment in accordance with product is that people should pay or be paid the average externality of their actions. And I think that's not just economics, but it's sort of common sense. If you think, if I do something that hurts you, I should have to pay you in proportion to how much I hurt you, right? And this is exactly what markets do in cases when things are not external, right? Externality policy is really just getting the market operating again in areas where it's failed to be working, right? Okay. Now, solutions, the second part of Pagu's principle of payments in accordance with product is that solutions should focus as narrowly as possible on the area where the price is actually missing. So, sometimes people want to intervene motivated by an externality problem in a way that has only a tangential relationship to the actual problem that's being solved. So one classic example of that is you often hear, like, say in these presidential debates, that to stimulate the economy, we need to give more money to people so they'll spend more. Now that's a little bit strange. If a company was polluting, would you say, let's give some money to that company and hope that they pollute less, right? Usually what you would do instead is tax them for polluting. So it seems to me a much more natural policy is to give money to people for buying stuff, right? Like you could give people a check that would expire at the end of the year, and they actually have to buy stuff with that. Or you could reduce sales taxes so they pay less tax on the things that they're buying at the moment. That's much more directly targeted at the issue of people not spending enough. Or rather than giving companies money so that they hopefully hire workers, you could give them subsidies for hiring workers, right? That would be much more targeted at the problem that you think exists. Yeah, go ahead.
But wouldn't a specific subsidy divert other money they had? Like, if they were planning on saving the money you give them, instead they would spend the money you give them and save the money they would otherwise spend.
Well, so that's true, unless you give them more money than they're spending every year, because then they're forced to spend more. So I mean, the best thing is to give them either some sort of spending quota of how much they have to spend, and that's tradable, or have some subsidy on spending, like reducing sales taxes in the States, right? But yeah, that's right. Okay. So some people have called for a cyclically varying sales tax as opposed to just giving people money. Okay. Now I want to think about some things that might appear to be externalities but really are not externalities. So imagine that I discover a giant hoard of gold. And that causes gold prices to fall.